The officer's name was Inspector Graves, a man of 50 with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent his career navigating the contradictions between what people said and what they actually meant. He had arrived from the market town of Ashford Cross some 20 minutes after the initial call, and he now stood in the drawing room of Thornfield Park with a notebook in one hand, and the sort of expression that suggested he had already begun cataloguing the inconsistencies that would, in his experience, inevitably emerge. The body, he had informed them with deliberate understatement, was that of a woman, discovered in the far greenhouse among the tomato plants and climbing jasmine, positioned in such a way that she appeared to have fallen backward into the potting bench. Initial examination suggested she had been struck on the head with considerable force, though the precise instrument had not yet been identified. The body had not been there that morning, as Hawkins had conducted his routine inspection at 7 o'clock, and the greenhouse had been locked afterward, a detail that seemed to carry some weight in the inspector's mind. Miss Marple watched from her position near the window as the guests were separated into groups and taken to various rooms for preliminary statements, a process that immediately began to reveal the sort of social hierarchy that one might expect in such circumstances. The Ashfords, of course, were permitted to remain in the drawing room, though Victor was asked to step aside with the inspector for a more detailed conversation. Richard had requested permission to retire to his room, citing a headache, which was granted with barely a glance. The vicar and his wife were shown to the study, their expressions registering the sort of anxious distress that came from being caught up in something that violated their sense of proper order. Dr. Price was asked to remain in the morning room, where he sat with the careful posture of someone aware that his every movement might be observed and interpreted. Miss Harrington had been placed in the library, where Miss Marple noted with interest that she did not pace nervously as most people did when confined, but rather sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. The question of the dead woman's identity hung over everything like a fog that would not lift. Inspector Graves had not yet revealed who she was, a tactical decision that Miss Marple understood immediately. Withholding the information would allow him to observe how people reacted when they were finally told, which reactions might differ significantly from their initial expressions of shock at hearing that a body had been discovered. The detective work, Miss Marple reflected, always involved understanding that the first response was rarely the most honest one. It took time for people to adjust their expressions to match whatever social expectations they believed should govern their behavior. It was Victor Ashford who finally asked the question directly, his voice steady, but with an undertone of something that might have been dread. "Who was the woman in the greenhouse?" he inquired, "and under what circumstances had such a terrible thing occurred on his property?" Inspector Graves consulted his notebook with the theatrical pause that investigators often employed, though whether this was genuine uncertainty or calculated effect was difficult to determine. The victim, he said, had been identified by several distinctive features and personal effects found near the body. Her name was Catherine Winters, aged 48, and she had been residing at the King's Head Inn for the past 3 weeks. She had claimed to be a journalist conducting research into the history of local estates, though her actual purpose in Little Ambleton had been less clearly defined. The name produced a reaction that was immediately suppressed, but not before Miss Marple observed it. Victor Ashford's hand had tightened on the arm of his chair. Margaret Ashford's breath had caught in her throat, a small sound quickly covered by a cough. Dr. Price, visible through the doorway, had gone even paler than before. Richard, summoned back to the drawing room at this point, had simply closed his eyes for a moment, as though absorbing a blow. Only Miss Harrington's expression had remained unchanged, though her hands, Miss Marple noted, had gripped the arms of her chair with sudden intensity when the name was announced. Inspector Graves was watching all of them, his notebook recording not words but observations. He then asked a question that seemed to emerge from nowhere, but was, in fact, quite calculated. Had any of them known Catherine Winters previously, or had any of them encountered her since her arrival in the village 3 weeks ago? The question hung in the air like something physical. Victor looked at his wife. Margaret looked at her hands. Dr. Price looked at the floor. Richard lit a cigarette with a hand that trembled slightly. Miss Harrington continued to look out the window, and Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her chair, noted that every single one of them had hesitated before responding, and that their hesitations had all taken subtly different forms. Victor eventually said that he did not recognize the name, though Catherine Winters seemed somehow familiar, which could be explained by any number of reasons. Margaret said nothing. Dr. Price, when asked directly, admitted that he had encountered the woman briefly at the inn and had had a conversation with her about medical matters, though nothing of significance. Richard said that he had not met her, though he had perhaps seen her about the village. Miss Harrington, when it came her turn, said quietly that she had known Catherine Winters many years ago, in a previous life, and she was quite shocked to learn of her death. This confession produced a sudden intensification of interest from Inspector Graves, who requested that Miss Harrington provide him with considerably more detail about the nature of their previous acquaintance. Miss Marple, watching this unfold with the concentration of someone observing the first threads in a tapestry beginning to unravel, understood that the afternoon had marked a definitive boundary between before and after. Something that had been hidden was now beginning to emerge. Slowly, reluctantly, like something rising from murky water. The greenhouse had given up its secret, and now the village itself would begin to do the same. Miss Harrington's revelation seemed to create a peculiar stillness in the drawing room, the sort of silence that comes when people realize they are standing at a threshold between what they had believed to be true and something altogether different. Inspector Graves had leaned forward with a subtle shift of posture that indicated genuine interest, though his expression remained neutral, a practiced mask that betrayed nothing of his internal calculations. He requested, with the courtesy that masked an absolute demand, that Miss Harrington elaborate on her previous acquaintance with the deceased, providing specific details about when and where they had known one another, and under what circumstances their paths had diverged. Miss Harrington rose from her chair with a composure that suggested she had been anticipating this conversation, though her voice, when she spoke, carried a tremor that suggested the reality of the situation had only just begun to penetrate her carefully maintained emotional distance. She had known Catherine Winters, she explained in London, approximately 25 years prior. They had both been employed in the same household at that time, though in different capacities and at different social levels. Catherine had been a lady's maid to the mistress of the house, while Miss Harrington had served as a governess to the family's children. Their acquaintance had been cordial but not intimate, the sort of relationship that existed between staff members who shared a workplace, but not a confidential bond. They had lost contact when Miss Harrington had moved to another position and had not, to her knowledge, encountered one another since. The explanation was plausible, the sort of answer that might easily be verified or contradicted by sufficiently diligent investigation, and Inspector Graves appeared to accept it as a starting point rather than a conclusion. However, he noted with careful emphasis, it was somewhat remarkable that a woman who had claimed to be researching the history of estates should have sought lodging in a small village and then encountered, quite by chance, someone from her distant past. Coincidences, he observed, were possible, but they were often worth examining rather than accepting at face value. He then asked Miss Harrington if she could account for her movements during the afternoon, specifically between the hours of 3 and 5 o'clock, when the medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested the murder had occurred. Miss Harrington replied that she had spent those hours in her cottage, reading, alone. She had not attended the garden party, she explained, because she had not been feeling well, and she had sent her regrets to Margaret Ashford that morning. Victor Ashford confirmed this, noting that a note had indeed arrived from Primrose Cottage declining the invitation. The confirmation seemed to satisfy the inspector only partially, as though he understood that a person being alone during the relevant hours proved nothing beyond the fact that no one could verify their whereabouts one way or another. He then turned his attention to the other guests, asking each of them to account for their movements during the critical period. The vicar recalled that he had been engaged in conversation with several guests in the garden, though he acknowledged that he had moved about the property and could not speak with absolute certainty about every moment. His wife corroborated this account, though she noted that she had briefly stepped inside to use the facilities at approximately 4 o'clock and had not seen anyone else in the interior rooms at that time. Dr. Price stated that he had remained outdoors for most of the afternoon, but had gone inside to refresh his drink at some point, though he was uncertain of the precise time. Richard Ashford said that he had been present in the garden throughout, but acknowledged that he had walked toward the far end of the property at one point, near the greenhouse, though he had not entered that building. This last statement produced a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a recognition that Richard had been in proximity to the crime scene at some point during the relevant time frame. Inspector Graves pressed for more detail, asking what had prompted Richard to walk in that direction, and Richard replied, with the casual indifference of someone who felt he had nothing to hide, that he had simply wanted some air and solitude, and he had wandered without any particular destination in mind. The inspector accepted this explanation with the same measured neutrality he had applied to all the others, though Miss Marple observed that he had made a note in his book, which suggested that this detail had registered as potentially significant. Victor Ashford then volunteered information that had not been requested. He stated that he had briefly checked on the greenhouse at approximately 3:30, wanting to ensure that the plants were being properly watered given the warm weather, and he had noted at that time that the door had been locked and the interior appeared normal. This information was crucial, as it established a time frame during which the murder must have occurred, sometime after 3:30 and before the body had been discovered at approximately 6 o'clock. Inspector Graves thanked him for this helpful detail, and then announced that he would require more thorough statements from everyone involved, and that no one would be permitted to leave Little Ambleton until the initial investigation had progressed beyond this preliminary stage. He requested that all guests depart Thornfield Park at this time, with the understanding that they would be contacted for formal interviews within the next day. As the assembled group began to move toward the exits, Miss Marple observed the various expressions of relief, anxiety, and something else entirely, something that looked remarkably like calculation. She gathered her handbag and prepared to take her leave, moving with the unhurried deliberation of an elderly woman who had nowhere particular to be, and no one who would hurry her. As she passed through the doorway, she paused to observe the greenhouse through the window, its glass panes catching the fading afternoon light, and she found herself wondering what secrets that small building might contain beyond the obvious fact of death. The village of Little Ambleton, by the following morning, had transformed itself into something resembling a small organism that had received a significant shock and was attempting to return to normal functioning while simultaneously processing the trauma of what had occurred. The news of Catherine Winters's death had spread through the community with the efficiency of a particularly effective nervous system, reaching even those corners where one might have thought such information could not possibly penetrate. Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage with a cup of tea growing cold beside her, was engaged in the sort of reflection that had served her well over many decades of observation. She had lived long enough to understand that the immediate aftermath of a crime was often as revealing as the crime itself, for people, in their shock and distress, frequently disclosed things they would normally have kept carefully concealed. She had received 3 visitors before 9 o'clock that morning, each of them ostensibly seeking her opinion on the matter, though what they actually seemed to want was either reassurance or validation for their own theories. The vicar's wife had called first, bearing a coffee cake that Miss Marple had not requested, but accepted with appropriate gratitude. She had spent 15 minutes explaining that the affair was most likely the work of a vagrant or someone from outside the village, as such things simply did not happen among people one knew, and surely the presence of a stranger in their midst must be regarded as suspicious. She had then gone on to express considerable concern about Miss Harrington, whom she had never properly warmed to, and whose previous acquaintance with the deceased seemed to her a coincidence too remarkable to be genuine. After the vicar's wife had departed, the postmaster's daughter had appeared with fresh bread, ostensibly on behalf of her mother, though she seemed primarily interested in gleaning information about what Miss Marple might have observed at the garden party. She had mentioned, somewhat casually, that Dr. Price's previous position in London had ended rather suddenly, and that his wife had left him under circumstances that had been deemed scandalous at the time. Facts which seemed to her to suggest that a man capable of keeping secrets was also capable of other transgressions. The third visitor had been more direct. Hawkins, the head gardener, had knocked on the door at 8:30 with the manner of someone performing a duty he found distasteful. He had wanted Miss Marple to understand, he had said, that the greenhouse had been quite secure the previous day, that he himself was responsible for checking the locks at the end of each day, and that he had done so at precisely 5 o'clock on the afternoon in question. The body must therefore have been placed in the greenhouse sometime between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock, a narrower window than Inspector Graves had initially suggested. This information had been delivered with the tone of someone establishing his own innocence, while simultaneously providing information that might redirect suspicion elsewhere. Miss Marple had listened to all three visitors with the polite attention they seemed to expect, asking gentle questions and making observations that seemed entirely innocent, while actually being designed to encourage them to reveal more than they had intended. The pattern that was beginning to emerge from these various conversations was becoming clearer, though still incomplete, like a picture puzzle with several key pieces missing. By midday, Inspector Graves had established a temporary office in the village hall, and he had begun conducting formal interviews with those who had been present at the garden party. Miss Marple had received a summons to appear at 2 o'clock, which she had acknowledged with perfect punctuality. The inspector's demeanor had become somewhat more businesslike in the formal setting, and he had begun by asking her to provide a detailed account of everything she had observed during the afternoon, not merely in terms of facts, but also in terms of the behavior and interactions of the people present. Miss Marple had answered carefully, describing the sequence of events with precision, noting that Margaret Ashford had excused herself at approximately 2:30, that Victor had been summoned by Hawkins, that various guests had moved about the property at different times, and that she had observed reactions to the news of Catherine Winters's identity that had seemed to her noteworthy. The inspector had then asked what specifically had seemed noteworthy about these reactions, and Miss Marple had replied, with the sort of delicate understatement that had served her well, that the name had seemed to produce recognition in several individuals who had initially denied knowing who the deceased was. She had observed, she continued, that Dr. Price's reaction had been particularly marked, and that Richard Ashford's had seemed to involve some element of resignation or acceptance rather than surprise. The inspector had listened to this assessment with evident interest, and he had made several notes before asking Miss Marple if she had any theories regarding the identity of the perpetrator. She had demurred, as was her custom, expressing the view that drawing conclusions prematurely was often counterproductive. However, she had added if she were investigating such a matter, she would be interested in understanding what Catherine Winters had actually been doing in Little Ambleton under the guise of researching estate history, and she would be curious to know whether her presence in the village had been as accidental as it appeared, or whether she had specifically sought out individuals she had known in her previous life. The inspector had appeared to find this observation useful, and he had dismissed her with thanks, noting that her perspective had been valuable. As Miss Marple had walked home through the village streets, she had observed people watching her from their windows and doorways, and she had understood that the investigation was already beginning to develop in predictable directions. That blame was being assigned based on proximity and suspicion, rather than evidence. By evening, when Dr. Price's arrest had been announced, she was not particularly surprised, though she found herself increasingly convinced that the matter was considerably more complex than the inspector seemed to believe. The arrest of Dr. Edmund Price had been conducted with the sort of discretion that one might expect from a professional police force operating in a small village, though discretion and secrecy were, Miss Marple understood, rather different matters, and the news of his detention had spread through Little Ambleton with remarkable speed. Inspector Graves had appeared at the physician's residence at approximately 7 o'clock in the evening, with a constable in attendance, and they had emerged some 40 minutes later with Dr. Price in custody, his face composed but his movements suggesting a man who had been bracing himself for this eventuality. The arrest had been based, according to the inspector's subsequent statement to those gathered in the village hall for an impromptu assembly, on several converging pieces of evidence. Dr. Price had admitted to knowing Catherine Winters when pressed during his formal interview, though he had initially denied this acquaintance. He had been located in proximity to the greenhouse during the critical time frame, having gone there ostensibly to inspect certain medicinal plants. He possessed knowledge of various substances that could induce unconsciousness. A relevant detail given the preliminary medical examination had suggested the victim had been struck while potentially incapacitated. Furthermore, according to the inspector, certain financial irregularities in Dr. Price's affairs had come to light during preliminary investigation, suggesting he had been under considerable stress and in need of funds that he might have expected Catherine Winters to provide or withhold depending on their previous relationship. The assembled villagers had listened to this recitation with the sort of satisfied relief that comes when apparent chaos is suddenly resolved into apparent order, and Miss Marple had observed their faces with the attention of someone noting the variations of emotion on display. Relief, certainly, but also something else in some expressions, something that looked rather like doubt or perhaps anxiety. The vicar's wife had seemed to accept the conclusion with the contentment of someone whose initial theory had been validated by events. The postmaster's daughter had looked thoughtful, as though turning something over in her mind. Margaret Ashford had appeared somewhat strained, her fingers working at the pearls around her neck with a repetitive motion that suggested tension rather than casual nervousness. Victor Ashford had maintained his earlier composure, though Miss Marple noted that he had positioned himself slightly apart from his wife, creating a physical distance that had not been apparent before the arrest. Richard Ashford had not attended the assembly, a notable absence that Miss Marple found significant, though she could not have articulated precisely why. Miss Harrington had stood at the back of the hall, her expression unreadable, and she had left before the assembly concluded, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who was not in flight, but was not inclined to remain in that particular space. The following morning, Miss Marple received a visitor who had not previously sought her counsel. Margaret Ashford appeared at the cottage door at approximately 10 o'clock, and her demeanor had shifted substantially from the composed hostess of the garden party. She appeared anxious, her carefully maintained appearance showing signs of having been hastily arranged rather than thoughtfully prepared. She had requested Miss Marple's permission to speak in confidence, and Miss Marple had offered her tea and the sort of gentle attention that had a way of encouraging people to disclose things they had intended to keep private. Margaret had begun by acknowledging that the events of the previous days had been extremely distressing, and that she felt compelled to provide information to someone who might understand its significance. She had then explained, with considerable hesitation and obvious discomfort, that Catherine Winters had not been a complete stranger to the Ashford family, as they had initially suggested. Rather, Catherine had been employed as a maid in the household of Victor's late mother many years ago, before Margaret and Victor were married. Catherine had been dismissed from that position under circumstances that had been deemed delicate at the time, circumstances that had involved an inappropriate relationship between Catherine and a member of the household. Margaret had been reluctant to specify precisely which member, but her meaning had been sufficiently clear that Miss Marple understood she was referring to Victor himself. Catherine Winters had apparently borne a child as a result of this relationship, though the child had been given up for adoption almost immediately, and Catherine had subsequently moved away and had attempted to build a life with minimal connection to her past. The information had been conveyed with evident distress, and Margaret had seemed to be speaking as much from a need to unburden herself as from any conviction that the information would be helpful to the investigation. Miss Marple had listened without interrupting, and when Margaret had finally fallen silent, she had asked, with careful gentleness, whether Catherine's return to Little Ambleton might have been motivated by something other than estate research. Margaret had nodded slowly, acknowledging that she suspected Catherine had come to seek some form of financial compensation or acknowledgement from Victor regarding the circumstances of their past relationship and the child that had resulted from it. Whether Catherine had made contact with Victor directly before her death, Margaret could not say with certainty, though the tension in the household in recent weeks suggested that something significant had occurred. After Margaret's departure, Miss Marple had sat with her cooling tea and had contemplated the nature of secrets and how they accumulated over time like layers of sediment, each one pressing down upon those beneath it, creating pressure that eventually found release in ways that nobody had anticipated. The arrest of Dr. Price had seemed to her less like the solution to a puzzle and more like the placement of a single piece that might be correct, or might have been forced into position to create an appearance of completeness. She had decided that she would need to speak with certain individuals more directly, and she would need to do so in ways that might encourage them to reveal the distinctions between what they believed to be true and what actually was. The greenhouse, she reflected, had given up its dead, but not yet its secrets. The information that Margaret Ashford had provided altered the investigative landscape considerably, though Inspector Graves appeared to interpret the revelation as further confirmation of Dr. Price's guilt rather than as a complicating factor that demanded more nuanced examination. When Miss Marple had mentioned, in passing during an encounter at the village post office, that she had spoken with Margaret Ashford, and that certain details regarding Catherine Winters' history with the Ashford family had emerged, the inspector had seemed to regard this as corroborating evidence of motive. A man with a secret past connection to a woman who had suddenly reappeared in his life, he had reasoned, would have considerable incentive to silence her before she could reveal information that might damage his reputation or his marriage. The logic was sound on its surface, the sort of reasoning that made sense to courts and juries and the general public, though Miss Marple had found herself increasingly troubled by the neatness of the conclusion. She had lived long enough to understand that genuine guilt often came accompanied by loose threads and inconsistencies, whereas fabricated guilt could be constructed with remarkable efficiency if one selected one's evidence carefully enough and ignored those details that did not fit the preferred narrative. By the third day following Catherine Winters' death, Richard Ashford had begun to attract a different species of attention within the village. He had been observed leaving the house at irregular hours, and he had been seen speaking with Miss Harrington on 2 separate occasions, conversations that appeared to involve considerable intensity despite their outwardly casual appearance. Miss Marple had noted these observations not because she credited village gossip as reliable truth, but because she understood that what people chose to observe and discuss often revealed something about their own preoccupations and suspicions. She had decided that it would be profitable to engage Richard Ashford in conversation, and she had arranged, through the simple expedient of encountering him near the village library, to walk with him toward his home. Richard had seemed somewhat surprised by her attention, though he had accepted her company with the politeness that his upbringing had instilled in him. As they had walked, Miss Marple had engaged him in conversation about various inconsequential matters: the state of the gardens, the quality of the recent weather, the tedium of the investigation, and its disruption to normal village life. It was only when they had reached the point where they would naturally part company that she had asked, with the sort of casual indifference that belied the careful intentionality of the question, whether he had known Catherine Winters personally, or if his familiarity with her had been limited to what he had observed during the garden party and its aftermath. Richard had hesitated, a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but seemed to stretch considerably longer. He had then replied, with the carefulness of someone selecting words to convey a specific impression, that he had perhaps encountered her in the village, but had not been acquainted with her in any meaningful sense. The reply had been precisely calibrated to suggest innocence, while leaving open the possibility of deception, and Miss Marple had filed this observation away alongside all the others she had been accumulating. The conversation had then moved into safer territory, and they had parted with mutual civility. That evening, Miss Marple had received a visitor whose appearance at her door had surprised her, though upon reflection she realized she had been expecting him, or someone like him, almost from the beginning. Dr. Price's solicitor, a man named Ashworth from the market town, had appeared requesting a conversation about certain matters related to the investigation. He had explained that his client maintained his innocence and that he had been advised by counsel to speak with Miss Marple, as her perspective on the events at Thornfield Park might provide information that could support Dr. Price's defense. Miss Marple had invited him inside, and over tea, the solicitor had explained several details that cast the investigation in a considerably different light. Dr. Price had indeed known Catherine Winters, but their acquaintance had been recent and limited to a single conversation at the King's Head Inn, during which Catherine had mentioned her previous employment at Thornfield and had asked whether Dr. Price knew the current residents of that property. Dr. Price had admitted to the acquaintance during his formal interview only because he had realized that denying it would appear suspicious if Catherine had mentioned him to others. His presence near the greenhouse had been incidental to a walk he took regularly for exercise, a routine that was known to several villagers who had observed him on previous occasions. Most significantly, the financial irregularities that Inspector Graves had cited as evidence of motive appeared to relate to a gambling debt that Dr. Price had incurred before moving to Little Ambleton, a matter which he had been addressing through legitimate means and which bore no connection to Catherine Winters. The solicitor had suggested that the case against his client was being built on circumstantial evidence and convenient assumptions rather than on genuine proof of wrongdoing. After the solicitor's departure, Miss Marple had sat alone with her thoughts, and she had found herself wondering whether the investigation had been designed to solve the crime or whether it had been designed to reach a predetermined conclusion that would restore peace and order to the village. She understood that such thoughts were dangerous, that they suggested a skepticism about institutions and processes that society preferred one did not express too loudly. Yet she had observed enough of human nature to recognize that convenience and guilt were not always the same thing, and that a tidy solution often concealed messier truths beneath its surface. She decided that it was time to speak directly with Miss Harrington, and to ask certain questions that had been forming in her mind since the afternoon of the garden party. Miss Harrington's cottage was situated at the far edge of Little Ambleton, a small property with a well-maintained garden that suggested someone with both horticultural knowledge and considerable attention to detail. Miss Marple had telephoned ahead, a courtesy that had elicited agreement without enthusiasm, and she had arrived at precisely the time they had arranged, moving with the unhurried deliberation of age that masked a considerable sharpness of purpose. Miss Harrington had received her in the parlor, a room decorated with spare elegance and furnished in a manner that suggested taste rather than wealth. She had offered tea, which Miss Marple had accepted, and they had engaged in the sort of preliminary conversation that people undertake before approaching matters of genuine substance. It was Miss Harrington who had finally moved past these preliminaries, acknowledging with a sort of weary directness that she understood Miss Marple had not come merely for social purposes, and that she might as well explain her presence in Little Ambleton and her connection to the deceased. The explanation had unfolded with the careful precision of something that had been rehearsed, though not so polished as to suggest dishonesty. Miss Harrington had indeed known Catherine Winters many years previously, and they had worked in the same household in London as members of the domestic staff. However, their relationship had been considerably closer than mere collegial acquaintance, and when Catherine had contacted her 3 months prior, requesting that she meet with her in Little Ambleton, Miss Harrington had recognized it as an opportunity that she could not refuse. Catherine had explained that she was investigating the history of the Ashford family for reasons that she had initially been reluctant to specify, and she had needed the assistance of someone who understood the dynamics of the household and who had maintained a connection to Little Ambleton. Miss Harrington had moved to Primrose Cottage under a pretext of retirement, though her actual purpose had been to assist Catherine in understanding certain aspects of the Ashford family's history and relationships. The nature of this assistance had gradually become clearer as Catherine had disclosed the true reason for her interest in the Ashfords. Catherine had borne a son 25 years previously, a child fathered by Victor Ashford during a period when Victor had not yet met Margaret. The child had been placed for adoption, and Catherine had spent the subsequent years attempting to locate him and to understand what had become of him. Her research had eventually led her to believe that the child had been adopted by a family in the region and might have grown to manhood in proximity to Little Ambleton without either he or she being aware of the other's presence. Catherine had come to the village with the intention of investigating whether her son might be living there, and she had hoped that Miss Harrington's knowledge of the area and the families residing in it might assist in this research. Miss Marple had listened to this account with considerable interest, and when Miss Harrington had concluded, she had asked, with the delicate precision that characterized her questioning, whether Catherine had actually located her son or whether she had made contact with any members of the Ashford family regarding her true purposes. Miss Harrington had hesitated at this point, and her hesitation had conveyed considerable information. She had eventually replied that Catherine had indeed made contact with Richard Ashford, approaching him indirectly and gradually revealing aspects of her history with the family, though not immediately disclosing the full truth regarding the nature of her connection to his father. Richard had apparently reacted with shock and distress to this disclosure, and he had promised to speak with his father about the matter. Catherine had been waiting for this conversation to occur, hoping that it might lead to some form of acknowledgement or reconciliation. However, Richard had not followed through on this promise, and Catherine had grown increasingly frustrated and angry about his apparent abandonment of her cause. It was at this point in Miss Marple's conversation with Miss Harrington that a crucial detail emerged. Miss Harrington had mentioned, almost in passing, that Catherine had also contacted Dr. Price, not because she had any connection to him, but because she had believed, incorrectly, that he might be her son. She had apparently harbored a suspicion based on certain details that had proven to be mistaken, and she had approached Dr. Price with a series of questions designed to determine whether he fit the profile of the child she had placed for adoption. Dr. Price had responded to these inquiries with confusion and professional concern, and he had attempted to direct Catherine toward appropriate counseling resources. Catherine had then abandoned this line of investigation, accepting that Dr. Price could not be her son. The information had struck Miss Marple with considerable force, as it fundamentally altered her understanding of the relationships between the various parties involved in the investigation. She had asked Miss Harrington, with careful precision, whether Richard Ashford might have been Catherine's actual son, born not to Victor but to someone else entirely, and whether Richard's resistance to Catherine's overtures might have been motivated by something other than mere inconvenience or embarrassment. Miss Harrington's silence at this question had been extraordinarily eloquent, and when she had finally spoken, her voice had carried a quality of resignation that suggested she had been burdened by this knowledge for some considerable time. She had confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion, acknowledging that Catherine, during their conversations in the weeks preceding her death, had begun to believe that Richard Ashford might be her son. Catherine had conducted research into the family's history and had discovered that Richard's birth date was consistent with the timeline of her pregnancy, and that his adoption into the Ashford family had occurred when he was approximately 3 months old. Catherine had been attempting to verify this suspicion through careful observation and discreet inquiry, though she had not yet approached Richard directly with this hypothesis. As Miss Marple had walked home through the gathering dusk, she had understood that the investigation had now entered entirely different territory, and that the truth regarding Catherine Winter's death was far more complex and far more painful than Inspector Graves had imagined. The greenhouse, she reflected, had perhaps not been the scene of a crime motivated by simple fear or desire for silence, but rather a convergence point of much older griefs and hidden relationships finally brought into collision with one another. The following morning, Miss Marple had requested a private audience with Inspector Graves at the village hall, and she had presented her conclusions with the careful presentation of someone who understood that she was challenging the inspector's judgment, and who wished to do so with sufficient tact that her observations might be received with an open mind rather than defensive dismissal. She had outlined the information that Miss Harrington had provided, explaining the complexity of Catherine Winter's true purposes in Little Ambleton, and suggesting that the investigation had perhaps focused on the wrong individual, because it had operated from incomplete understanding of the victim's motivations and relationships. Inspector Graves had listened with an expression that shifted gradually from skepticism to something more closely resembling thoughtful consideration, though he had ultimately maintained that the evidence against Dr. Price remained substantial, and that alternative theories, however interesting, did not alter the fundamental facts of the case. Miss Marple had accepted this response without argument, understanding that it was often futile to attempt to convince someone who had already committed themselves to a particular conclusion, though she had requested permission to conduct certain inquiries of her own. A request that the inspector had granted with evident reluctance, and only after she had assured him that her inquiries would not interfere with the official investigation. That afternoon, Miss Marple had encountered Richard Ashford at the village library, where she had been returning books and where he had apparently been seeking respite from the continued attention that had attached itself to his family name. She had engaged him in conversation about literature and the merits of various authors before gradually shifting to more personal topics, and she had asked him, with a sort of gentle indirection that seemed to come naturally to her, whether the events of recent days had been particularly distressing for him. Richard had replied with the careful neutrality of someone aware that his words might be interpreted and analyzed by multiple parties, and Miss Marple had pressed gently further, suggesting that she had gathered from various conversations that Catherine Winters's presence in the village had affected him in ways that perhaps he had not anticipated. At this point, Richard's composure had faltered slightly, and he had acknowledged, with evident reluctance, that Catherine Winters had approached him with certain claims regarding his family history, claims that he had found deeply disturbing and difficult to process. Miss Marple had then asked, with characteristic delicacy, whether Catherine had suggested that there was a biological relationship between them, and Richard had nodded slowly, his jaw tightening visibly. He had explained that Catherine had claimed to be his biological mother, having placed him for adoption as an infant, before he had been taken in by the Ashford family. Richard had initially dismissed this claim as the fantasy of an unstable woman, but Catherine had provided certain details about his adoption and his early history that had suggested she possessed genuine knowledge that was not publicly available. The disclosure had shaken him profoundly, as it had called into question his understanding of his own identity and his place within the family structure that had defined his entire life. He had not yet spoken with his father about Catherine's claims, as he had been uncertain how Victor would respond and whether the revelation would damage relationships that he valued despite the complications that seemed to characterize his family dynamics. Miss Marple had then posed the critical question with the gentleness of someone asking about something deeply painful rather than something suspicious. She had inquired whether in the days before Catherine's death, Richard had arranged to meet with her to discuss her claims further, and whether that meeting had taken place in the greenhouse at Thornfield Park. Richard had appeared to struggle with this question, and his eventual response had come only after considerable internal conflict. He had admitted that he had arranged to meet Catherine on the afternoon of the garden party, having asked her to come to the greenhouse after the guests had begun to disperse, as he wished to speak with her away from public view and without the knowledge of his family. The meeting had been emotionally tumultuous, with Catherine attempting to establish a relationship with him and Richard oscillating between rejection and a desperate desire to understand the truth regarding his origins. Catherine had brought with her certain documents that she claimed proved her identity and her relationship to him, and she had pressed him repeatedly to acknowledge her as his biological mother and to consider some form of ongoing relationship or at least contact. Richard had become increasingly distressed during this encounter, and he had told Catherine that he needed time to process what she was telling him before he could make any decisions about how to proceed. He had asked her to give him several days to come to terms with the information before she made any disclosures to his father or to anyone else in the family. Catherine had apparently agreed to this request, and Richard had returned to the garden party, intending to speak with her again several days hence. However, by that evening, Catherine Winters was dead, and Richard had been plunged into a state of profound confusion about the truth regarding her death and his own role or lack thereof in the events that had transpired. Miss Marple had listened to this account with careful attention, noting not merely what Richard said but also the manner in which he said it, the hesitations and emotional currents that flowed beneath the surface of his words. She had then asked, very quietly, whether Richard had any knowledge of who might have been responsible for Catherine's death, or whether he had observed anything during or after his meeting with Catherine that had seemed significant or troubling. Richard had shaken his head, insisting that when he had left the greenhouse, Catherine had been alive and apparently preparing to depart from Thornfield. He had not observed anyone else in proximity to the greenhouse, though he acknowledged that he had not remained there long enough to verify what Catherine might have done after his departure.
As Miss Marple had walked home, she had understood that Richard was almost certainly telling the truth regarding his own actions, and that the real sequence of events had likely involved someone else entirely. Someone who had been motivated by concerns and passions that had nothing whatsoever to do with Catherine's search for her biological child, and everything to do with the preservation of family reputation and the protection of secrets that had been buried for far too long. The piece of information that had been troubling Miss Marple since the afternoon of the garden party finally crystallized into coherent significance as she sat in her parlor that evening, reviewing in her mind the sequence of events and the various details that had seemed.
She had noticed during her observation of Margaret Ashford on the day of the murder that Margaret had excused herself from the garden at approximately 2:30, and that she had returned with her composure restored but with a certain brittleness to her manner that suggested emotional disturbance. Margaret had gone inside the house, and she had been absent for approximately 10 minutes before returning to the guests. At the time, this absence had seemed unremarkable, the sort of domestic necessity that frequently interrupts social gatherings. However, when examined in light of subsequent disclosures, the timing and Margaret's demeanor took on a considerably different character. Miss Marple had also recalled that Margaret's fingers had been engaged in repeated agitation of her pearl necklace on the evening following the murder, a physical manifestation of anxiety that suggested considerable internal turmoil. Furthermore, there had been an exchange between Margaret and Victor during the morning after Catherine's death, a conversation that Miss Marple had partially overheard while passing their house, in which Margaret had asked Victor whether he had told anyone about Catherine's claims, and Victor had replied that he had not, though he had received a visit from Catherine Winters at the house earlier that afternoon, a visit that Margaret appeared not to have known about until after the fact. The implication was becoming unavoidable, though Miss Marple had resisted drawing it until she had accumulated sufficient evidence to make it nearly certain. She had decided that she would need to speak directly with Margaret Ashford, and she had sent a note requesting a meeting at the cottage on the following afternoon. Margaret had arrived punctually, though her manner had been considerably more guarded than it had been during her previous visit, and Miss Marple had observed that Margaret's eyes had carried a quality of desperate calculation, as though she were attempting to determine what Miss Marple knew and what she might do with that knowledge. Miss Marple had begun the conversation gently, asking Margaret how she had been managing the stress of recent events, and then gradually introducing the topic of Catherine Winters's true purposes in the village. She had suggested that Catherine's research into the Ashford family history had likely been motivated by her search for the child she had placed for adoption, and that this research might have led her to approach various members of the family with her claims. Margaret had initially maintained her composure, but as Miss Marple had continued to outline what she had discovered, Margaret's resistance had begun to crumble. Finally, with the quality of someone who could no longer sustain deception, Margaret had acknowledged that Catherine had indeed come to the house, and that she had revealed to Margaret the nature of her relationship to Victor and her search for their child. Margaret had found the disclosure profoundly unsettling, not because of any moral objection to Victor's youthful indiscretion, but because Catherine had suggested that she intended to remain in Little Ambleton and to cultivate a relationship with Richard, potentially threatening the stability and privacy of the Ashford family. Catherine had apparently expressed her intention to inform Richard of his true parentage, and she had seemed determined to establish some form of ongoing connection with her biological son, regardless of the disruption this might cause to Richard's life and to the family's reputation. Margaret had become increasingly distressed during this conversation, and she had asked Catherine to reconsider her plans, offering her financial assistance if she would agree to leave the village and abandon her pursuit of contact with Richard. Catherine had refused, expressing the view that no amount of money could compensate her for the loss of the years she had been separated from her child, and that she was determined to know him regardless of the consequences. Margaret had then made a decision that would change everything. She had asked Catherine to meet with her in the greenhouse that afternoon, claiming that she wished to have a private conversation away from the house, and that the greenhouse would provide the necessary privacy. Catherine had agreed, and Margaret had returned to the garden party while Catherine had gone to the greenhouse to wait. At approximately 4 o'clock, Margaret had excused herself once more and had walked to the greenhouse. What had occurred during that meeting remained, in Margaret's account, somewhat obscured by emotional distress and conflicting recollections, though the essential facts seemed clear enough. Catherine had again refused Margaret's offers of money and her pleas to leave the village. The conversation had become heated, with Margaret expressing her fear that Catherine's presence would destroy the family and cause irreparable harm to Richard. Catherine had remained unmoved by these arguments, and Margaret, in a moment of desperation and fury that she had not known herself to be capable of, had seized a length of bamboo staking used for supporting tomato plants, and had struck Catherine repeatedly, the force of her blows eventually crushing the base of Catherine's skull. Margaret had then, with the practical clarity that sometimes accompanies profound shock, had arranged Catherine's body among the potting materials, and had locked the greenhouse behind her, intending, she supposed, that the body would not be discovered for some time, allowing her to establish an alibi and to obscure the nature of the crime. Miss Marple had listened to this confession with the expression of someone who had suspected much of this, but had hoped to be proven wrong. She had then asked Margaret why she was disclosing this information to her, and Margaret had replied with the hollow tone of someone beyond the reach of practical considerations that she could no longer sustain the deception. That Dr. Price's arrest had forced her to confront the reality that an innocent man was being punished for a crime he had not committed, and that her conscience, which she had attempted to silence, had finally reasserted itself with unbearable force. Miss Marple had remained silent for a long moment following Margaret's confession, understanding that the situation had moved beyond the realm of intellectual puzzle-solving into the painful territory of human consequence and moral responsibility. She had then asked Margaret whether she had informed anyone else of her culpability, and Margaret had replied that she had not, that only Miss Marple now knew the truth, and that Margaret had chosen to disclose it to her specifically because she had believed that Miss Marple, with her long years of observation and her evident understanding of human nature, would know how to proceed in a manner that might preserve some shred of dignity and humanity from the wreckage of recent events. Miss Marple had explained, with careful precision, that she could not and would not conceal knowledge of a crime, and that Margaret's confession must be brought to the attention of Inspector Graves and the proper authorities, though she had also acknowledged that Margaret's motive, however terrible its expression, had not been motivated by simple malice or greed, but by a desperate, misguided attempt to protect her family from what she perceived as an existential threat. Margaret had accepted this pronouncement with the resignation of someone who had perhaps expected nothing different, and who had confessed as much from a need for absolution as from any belief that confession might alter the ultimate consequence of her actions. Miss Marple had then accompanied Margaret to the village hall, where Inspector Graves had been reviewing the evidence against Dr. Price in preparation for the matter proceeding to formal charges. The inspector's reaction to Margaret's confession had progressed through several distinct stages, beginning with skepticism, moving through astonishment, and finally settling into a grim acceptance of the reality that the investigation had proceeded along an incorrect path and that the true perpetrator of the crime had been standing among them all along. He had immediately arranged for Margaret's formal arrest and detention, and he had simultaneously initiated the process of releasing Dr. Price from custody, a process that carried with it the unavoidable recognition that an innocent man had suffered considerable trauma and indignity as a result of investigative error. The news of Margaret Ashford's arrest had swept through Little Ambleton with the force of a storm, and by evening every resident of the village had heard some version of the events that had transpired. The vicar's wife had called upon Miss Marple with a mixture of shock and vindication, her earlier suspicions having been proven incorrect, but her conviction that someone in the village bore responsibility for the crime having been validated, though not in the manner she had anticipated. The postmaster's daughter had appeared with barely concealed excitement, eager to confirm various details and to ensure that she understood the complete sequence of events. Hawkins, the head gardener, had come to the cottage with a quality of deep sadness in his bearing, having apparently harbored some affection for Margaret, and finding himself unable to reconcile his knowledge of her as a conscientious employer with her capacity for violence. Victor Ashford had not left the house since Margaret's arrest, and Richard had apparently taken refuge in his room, his emotional state rendered even more turbulent by the revelation that his biological mother had been murdered by the woman who had raised him as her own son, that his existence as Richard Ashford had been premised on deception, and that he was now motherless in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Inspector Graves had returned to the cottage to speak with Miss Marple once more, and he had approached the conversation with a quality of professional humility that suggested he had come to understand that his investigation, while ultimately successful in identifying the actual perpetrator, had followed an inefficient and damaging path that could have been avoided had he possessed her capacity for nuanced observation and psychological understanding. He had thanked her for her assistance, and had acknowledged that her insights had been instrumental in arriving at the truth, a recognition that Miss Marple had accepted with the graciousness of someone who harbored no ill will toward him, but who understood that such investigations would inevitably be subject to the limitations of human perception and institutional expectation. Dr. Price had come to the cottage to thank Miss Marple personally. His relief at being exonerated mingled with sadness at the manner in which truth had finally emerged, and at the recognition that Catherine Winters had been murdered by someone seeking to prevent her from revealing information that had been properly his to discover for himself. He had expressed his intention to leave Little Ambleton and to return to London, where he had accepted a position at a teaching hospital, and he had suggested that his brief sojourn in the village had perhaps been a mistake, though not for the reasons that he had initially feared. Miss Marple had offered him tea and sympathy, and she had suggested that sometimes the most valuable experiences are those that teach us truths about human nature that no amount of academic study could convey. As evening had descended upon the cottage, Miss Marple had sat alone with her reflection, considering the manner in which secrets, once released, could never be contained again, and how the attempt to preserve family reputation had resulted in the destruction of that very thing. She had thought of Margaret, now confined and awaiting trial, and of Richard, attempting to reconcile his understanding of himself with the revelation that his entire family structure had been constructed upon deception. She had thought of Catherine Winters, whose search for connection with her child had ended in violence and death, and of the child she had carried and relinquished, never knowing what his life would become. And she had understood once again that the quiet villages and seemingly ordered lives of small communities concealed depths of human suffering and moral complexity that rarely surfaced until some event forced them into the light. The trial of Margaret Ashford took place in the autumn, some 4 months after the events at Thornfield Park, and it proceeded with the inevitability of a tragedy whose outcome has been predetermined by the actions of its characters. The courtroom had been filled with observers from Little Ambleton and beyond, people seeking to understand how a woman of apparent respectability and social standing could have committed an act of such violence, as though comprehension itself might serve as a defense against the knowledge that such things could occur in their own communities. Margaret had presented herself with dignity throughout the proceedings, neither denying her actions nor attempting to obscure the nature of what she had done. Her defense had rested upon arguments of temporary insanity and diminished capacity, suggesting that the stress of Catherine's revelations and the threat she posed to family stability had overwhelmed Margaret's rational faculties and driven her to an act that she would not, in her normal state of mind, have been capable of committing. The prosecution had countered that the evidence demonstrated premeditation, that Margaret had deliberately arranged to meet Catherine in a secluded location and had struck her with calculated force, and that the subsequent arrangement of the body and locking of the greenhouse indicated conscious awareness of wrongdoing and a deliberate attempt to conceal the crime. The jury had ultimately found Margaret guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, a verdict that reflected some recognition of the extraordinary circumstances that had precipitated her actions, while still holding her accountable for the consequences of those actions. She had been sentenced to 12 years' imprisonment, a punishment that would see her released in her 70s, assuming she survived the duration of her confinement. A circumstance that seemed to Miss Marple unlikely given the evident deterioration in Margaret's physical and emotional health that had become apparent throughout the trial. Victor Ashford had stood by his wife throughout the proceedings, attending every session and maintaining a posture of support that had seemed to most observers to be a demonstration of marital loyalty, though Miss Marple had observed the tension in his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes that suggested something more complex than simple devotion. Richard had attended only the final day of the trial, his presence notable by its usual absence, and he had sat in the back of the courtroom with an expression of such profound sadness that it had been difficult for anyone present to regard him without experiencing a sympathetic ache. Following the trial, Richard had left Little Ambleton to pursue studies at a university in Scotland, a distance that seemed to be as much emotional as geographic, and it was understood by those who had known him that he was unlikely to return to the village or to maintain substantial connection with his father. Miss Harrington had remained in Primrose Cottage, and she had become something of a quiet fixture in the village, moving through its streets and gathering places with the manner of someone who had been transformed by events into a permanent observer of community life. She had occasionally spoken with Miss Marple, and in these conversations she had expressed her conviction that Catherine had been seeking not merely acknowledgement from Richard, but some form of redemption through reconnection with the child she had been forced to relinquish. The tragedy, Miss Harrington had suggested, was that Catherine had never had the opportunity to know whether Richard might have accepted her, might have come to understand her circumstances with compassion, might have opened his life to include her in some meaningful way. Instead, she had been silenced by fear and violence, and Richard had been burdened with the knowledge of her existence and her death without ever having had the chance to shape his own response to her presence. As winter had descended upon Little Ambleton once more, Miss Marple had found herself reflecting on the manner in which the investigation had unfolded, and the various paths it might have taken had different individuals made different choices. She had considered the nature of secrets and the costs of maintaining them, the ways in which deception, even when motivated by love or the desire to protect those one cared for, inevitably accumulated pressure until it found release in destructive ways. She had thought of Margaret, in her prison cell, contemplating the moment in the greenhouse when her hand had grasped the bamboo stake and her fury had found physical expression. She had thought of Victor, who had fathered a child and then allowed that child to be taken from him, and who now found his marriage shattered and his son alienated by the consequences of youthful indiscretion and subsequent silence. She had thought of Richard, attempting to construct an identity that incorporated the knowledge of his biological origins while maintaining connection to the family that had raised him. And she had thought of Catherine, whose search for her child had ended not in reunion but in oblivion, her desire for connection and acknowledgement met with violence by someone who perceived her presence as a threat. One evening in December, as snow began to fall upon the gardens of Little Ambleton, Miss Marple had sat in her parlour with her knitting, reflecting on the events that had transpired and the manner in which they had illuminated certain fundamental truths about human nature. She had understood, as she had understood many times before over the course of her long life, that people were infinitely capable of both good and evil, that circumstances and choices could push anyone toward actions they would never have believed themselves capable of committing, and that the quiet villages and ordered lives that appeared so peaceful on the surface often concealed depths of passion, fear, and desperation that could erupt without warning into violence and tragedy. She had also understood that justice, while necessary and important, was sometimes blunt and insufficient, that it could punish wrongdoing without addressing the underlying pain and loss that had motivated that wrongdoing, and that the resolution of a crime was not the same thing as the resolution of the human struggles that had precipitated it. As the snow continued to fall, settling gently on the roofs and gardens of the village, Miss Marple had felt a familiar sense of melancholy acceptance, the understanding that came with age and experience that the world was neither orderly nor just, that good intentions could lead to terrible consequences, and that sometimes the most one could do was to observe, to understand, and to bear witness to the struggles and failures of those around one with compassion and without judgment.